So Maddie and I have these friends that we hang out with like every single night of the week, which is so weird to me because when I was a teenager, when I was a kid, during the summer when there's no school, I would go over to my friends' houses for like weeks at a time, and it was the best. And I never thought that I could live like that as an adult. But we have these friends that we hang out with like 4 to 5 nights a week, and they watch Izzy for us during the week when we go to work and stuff like that. So we're super close. Their names are Chris and Rachel. They're the best people. But what was so awkward is one day we're leaving their house. It's like 10 o'clock at night. We had been there for like all day long, and it had been snowing for a long time. And I don't remember exactly what Rachel said, but on our way out the door, she said something like, "Hey, watch your step, it's slippery out there." And without even like thinking, I just said, "Oh, thanks, love you." And I was like, immediately, you could like feel the awkwardness in the air where I was like, "Love you" to somebody who's not my wife, like we're not related. It's just kind of weird. Like, how many of you guys have said "I love you" to somebody and it was just super awkward, like a friend or your friend's parents? It's just like so weird, right? Like when we go to McDonald's, I remember a couple of weeks ago I went to McDonald's and this guy's like, "Here you go, enjoy your food," and I said, "Thanks, you too." And it was like, that's so awkward because he's not eating the food, I'm eating the food. Like we make that mistake all the time. But as we talk about love, and as we talk about dating relationships today, I think it's so important that we understand what that word love truly means. And so often we throw it around and it can be really awkward because we don't mean to say "I love it." But so often we throw it around like it's just another word that has really no meaning to it. Like we can say things like, "I love tacos." And sorry, that's a bad example because tacos are like a gift from God. But we say things like, or if you're me, like, "I loved that the Saints lost to the Rams a couple of weeks ago in the NFC Championship game. I love that." Why? Because I hate the New Orleans Saints. Why? Because they beat the Vikings back in 2009. But we throw that around like we love things and we love so many things. But some of these things that we say that we love don't always deserve the word love, because love is a very strong word. Love is meant to be a sacred word between like God and his people, or a husband and wife, or family members, or something that we deeply, deeply care about and truly love. But so many times we just throw around this word love so flippantly. But I think it's wise that we take back that word and we really think about, what does this word mean? And how is it to be used in our lives? And what does it look like that we love one another? And so as we talk about dating relationships today, as we talk about this whole relationTIPS series that we are in, I want you to hear first and foremost right away that I'm not going to stand up here and tell you you should not date. What I'm going to tell you is that you're in middle school or you're in high school, and so I think you need to be very wise about if you should date or not, or who you should date and what you do while you date. You need to be very wise in that. But I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that you shouldn't date, that you're too young, that you don't fully understand everything, because I don't think that's very helpful at all. Why? Because most of you are already dating, or you have dated, or you want to date. And so I think it's healthy that we talk about, what dating means and how we can do it in a way that is healthy and in a way that glorifies God and helps one another. Because there's the most dangerous thing that we can do in our relationships is try to get something out of it. And I think that this is one of the number one reasons why people get into dating relationships, especially in middle school and high school. Why? Because for a lot of us, we have insecurities. A lot of us, we long for things like we long to be loved, or we long to be wanted by somebody. And if we're not getting that at home like we feel like we should, or if we're not getting that at school or with certain friends, a lot of us will immediately run to try to find a guy or a girl who can fill that need of longing to be loved. But it becomes dangerous when either one or two of you are trying to get something out of the other person. A relationship can be very toxic when you have a motive that you're trying to get something from the other person, something that's missing in your life. See, when there's one or two people who have needs in their lives and all they're trying to do is take from the relationship instead of give towards the relationship, that's when relationships can become toxic. And that's when relationships can end in brokenness, in insecurity, and in failure. And so we have to be very careful when we talk about relationships, when we talk about dating, when we're in those relationships, that we're not hurting ourselves and that we're not hurting anybody. And so I want you guys to know that as your pastor, I not only care about what you do in your relationships. I not only care about like the actions that you might or might not take in your relationships, but I want you to know that I deeply care about your soul and I deeply care about your heart. And I don't want anybody getting into a relationship that's toxic or that's unhealthy and ending up with a broken heart. Because Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything that you do flows from it. And so what the Bible is telling us in this verse is that our heart is the source of everything that we do and everything that we feel. And if we put good things in our hearts, good things are going to come out of our lives. Or if we fill our lives with good and holy things, it's going to affect the way that we feel. It's going to affect the way that we talk. It's going to affect the way that we act. But if we fill our lives with evil, or if we fill our hearts with things that are toxic or unhealthy, if we're not careful about that, and we're allowing bad things to take place in our hearts, then we're going to see the consequences of that in our lives. And those consequences include things like insecurities or broken hearts because that guy or that girl treated you terribly, or they controlled you or manipulated you or guilted you because you didn't want to go that far physically, or you didn't want to go that far emotionally. See, the reality about relationships is that relationships and dating relationships are meant to magnify marriage, right? That's supposed to be the end goal of any dating relationship. And marriage is a sacred covenant between a man and a woman. And if we cross boundaries when we're dating that are meant strictly for marriage, whether that's physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, or spiritual boundaries, if we cross those while we're dating, then it can hurt us later on when we are finally married. Because if we don't end up marrying that person that we cross those boundaries with, it's going to hurt our future spouse. It's going to hurt our future relationships. And so what we have to understand right off the bat is that marriage is a sacred union that God has created. Marriage is a beautiful thing. And our dating relationships, whether we're in junior high, senior high, or whether we're 40 years old, all of our dating relationships are intended to lead towards marriage. And so I want to ask you right now, if you're in a relationship today, if you're dating somebody, is that your intention with your relationship? Is that something that's been on your mind? Like, hey, this could be the person I'm going to marry, or I have no intention of marrying this person. Because if we have no intention of marrying this person, there's no reason that we should be dating them. And so in the Bible, I just want to share this story with you guys. In the Bible, there's a guy named Samson. And Samson was known as one of the strongest guys, strongest humans to really ever live. And what's amazing about this story is it's a big, long story, so I'm just going to gloss through it really quick. But what's amazing about Samson is that his mom was barren. She couldn't have kids. And so she prayed and she prayed and she prayed and she asked God, hey, God, can you give me a kid? Can you bless me with a kid? All I want is a boy. All I want is a kid. And so God finally blessed her with a kid, but under certain conditions. She had to raise her boy, which turned out to be Samson. She had to raise him as what they call a Nazirite. And Nazirite people had certain vows in their culture that they had to take and that they could never break. Otherwise, God's blessing would break in their lives. And so part of that blessing and part of those vows was Samson could never cut his hair. As a Nazirite man, he could never cut his hair. He had to continue to let it grow and let it grow and let it grow. And we won't get into all the details why. It has to do a lot with holiness and culture and things like that. But he was told by God, do not cut your hair. Do not let anybody cut your hair. And if you cut your hair, all your strength that I'm going to give you and bless you with is going to go away. And so Samson knew this. Him and his mom had talked about this a lot. And it was a vow never to cut his hair. But then he met a woman. He met a woman named Delilah. And Delilah was one of those beautiful girls. She was one of those girls that could suck any guy in and just become infatuated with her. Because of her personality, because of her looks, and she was just one of those awesome girls. But what happened is Delilah and Samson, they started up this relationship, and Samson got fooled. See, one night they were talking, and Delilah was asking Samson about his strength. And she was trying to figure out how he got so strong. Because one of the stories in the Bible about Samson is he was tied to 2 pillars by his arms and his wrists, and he pulled the pillars down and the whole building came down. That's how strong Samson was. But people were trying to figure out how he got so strong. And so one night, Samson and Delilah are hanging out, and they're in this relationship, and they're talking, and things are starting to get intimate. And she says this in Judges chapter 16. This is where the story comes from. It says this. Then she said to Samson, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time that you have made a fool of me, and you haven't told me your secret of your great strength." And then it says, with such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. And so he told her everything. He said, "No razor has ever been used on my head, because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." And then he fell asleep. It says, after putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair. And then she began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Now, what we saw just happen is that Samson lost all of his strength. And this story goes on a little bit longer, but Samson ends up dying at the hands of the Philistine army because all of his strength went away from him when Delilah cut his hair. And I think that this is a great metaphor, and it's a great warning that if we do not protect our hearts in our dating relationships, it can destroy us. It can destroy us physically, it can destroy us mentally, it can destroy us emotionally, and it can destroy us even spiritually. If we are not ready and able and willing to guard our hearts against any guy or any girl or anything evil that can come into us, it can completely destroy us. And notice how Delilah gets Samson to tell her his secret. She says, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me?" See, what we're hearing is Delilah toying with Samson's heart and his emotions, when in reality, she had bad intentions. She's being manipulative. And how many times do we see this in our relationships when we're young and immature, right? As a guy or a girl, as a guy, I saw so many of my guy friends or classmates in school manipulate their girlfriends or just manipulate girls because they wanted to hook up. They would tell them how pretty they were. They would tell them how beautiful they were or how awesome they were. And in reality, they didn't care. They just wanted to hook up. And it's so easy to be manipulative. It's so easy to even let that into our lives when we're not protecting and guarding our hearts. And so I want to leave you guys with some practical tips when it comes to dating and relationships. I want to leave you guys with some practical things that we need to remember either before we start dating somebody, or if we're in the middle of our relationships. Here's how we can protect ourselves. Here's how we can have a healthy, growing, amazing relationship. Here's how we can have a godly relationship. So tip number 1, make sure the person that you are dating loves Jesus. If you're a Christ follower, the most important thing to you, if you're a Christian, should be that you are growing in your relationship with Jesus. But if you're with somebody who's not a Christian, they're not going to push you, they're not going to encourage you to grow in your relationship. They're not going to care if you skip church. They're not going to care if you skip youth group. They're not going to care if you forgot to pray that day. They're not going to totally care about you not relying on God when life gets hard. See, in a dating relationship, the person that we're dating should encourage us to pray when life is easy and when life is hard. In a dating relationship, that person, your partner, it should be the one to push you to pray when things get difficult. That person should push you to pray to read your Bible, to go to church, to want to grow in your faith. See, a healthy, godly relationship is when 2 people are pushing each other towards God and encouraging each other to grow in their relationship with God. But an unhealthy relationship is when your partner or your boyfriend or girlfriend pushes you just towards them because they're trying to get something out of the relationship constantly. And so tip number 1 is make sure the person that you are dating loves Jesus, they're a Christian, and they want to protect you and guard your heart. And tip number 2, date with intention. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but we have to date with intention. We can't just date for the sake of dating or for the sake of, you know what, my heart beats really fast and my tongue swells up a little bit whenever this person's in the room. I must love them. And so let's just date. Let's just start hanging out. We all get those feelings sometimes. But if we're just dating for the sake of dating, then we're missing the point. Like I said, marriage is meant to be this sacred union, this sacred covenant where it's just amazing things happen where we love each other. And our dating relationships are meant to lead towards that marriage. So date with intention. And then tip number 3 is don't play with emotions. And this happens so much, and we just talked about how manipulative Delilah was towards Samson. But if it's not going well, you need to have a talk. And if things need to end, then end it. See, unhealthy relationships are draining, but healthy relationships are life-giving. And if your relationship is unhealthy and not working, don't play with emotions. Don't play with people's lives and don't play with people's hearts. End it peacefully and just move on. And then number 4 is what we've been talking about, but guard your heart, right? What Proverbs says is that if we guard our hearts, everything flows from it. So we must guard ourselves and only let holy and pleasing things and good things into our lives. See, our hearts are precious. And when hearts get broken, lives get messed up. It's where your feelings, your relationship with God, your words, and where everything flows. And so your heart is the thing that God wants the most and that God wants to protect the most. And then number 5 is listen to your friends and family. And I know that this can be so difficult to do, especially when it comes to your parents. Because your parents are probably hounding you about who you're hanging out with, what they're like, what they like to do, and are you being safe? Are you doing all these things? And it's just like, parents, shut up. But our parents are much wiser than us. Our parents have been there before. Our parents have already made the mistakes that we don't want to make. And so even when it's difficult, recognize that your parents and your friends, they care deeply about you. And oftentimes when we're in the middle of a relationship, when we're like in love with somebody, we don't think very clearly. We don't see the things that other people who are on the outside of the relationship might see. And so when they want to have input, when they care enough about us to want to speak into our relationship and say, hey, you really need to be careful because I noticed this about your boyfriend. Or, hey, I was talking to your girlfriend last week and they said this and it was like, it was kind of alarming. So I just think you should know that when people say that to you, when people are concerned about the person that you're dating or they're concerned about your relationship, don't take it as they're just trying to judge you, they're trying to control you. They're doing it because they love you. And so listen. And then last but not least, tip number 6 is don't settle. Ephesians 2 verse 10 says that you are God's masterpiece. He's created you wonderfully and beautifully and with a purpose. Don't let someone who isn't worth it break your heart or drag you down. See, God wants your relationships to not only be healthy, but He wants your relationships to glorify Him. And if we just start dating just to date or because, we want to hook up or because we want to get something out of a relationship that we feel like we're lacking in our own lives, it's going to lead to brokenness, and it's unhealthy, and it's toxic. But if we want to date for the sake of, we want to figure out who we want to marry. We want to learn more about God and grow in our relationship with God. We want to push and encourage each other towards God together. That is what defines a healthy relationship. And so I want to leave you guys kind of with a challenge or something to think about. If you're ready to date, I want you to think about that between you and God. I want you to just sit and talk to God and bring it to God and say, hey, God, am I ready to date? Am I ready to be in a relationship romantically with somebody else? So I want you guys to think about that and pray about that. But 2, if you're already in a relationship, I want to challenge you to kind of sit with God and just pray and talk to God and listen for His voice and say, God, is this healthy? Are we pushing each other towards you? Or is this more about us than it is about you, God? Because the main thing that we need to do is protect our hearts. Because that is what God is after. And we want to glorify God in our relationships. And so I want to encourage you guys, sit with God, talk to God, allow him to give you wisdom. If you are ready to take that step to be in a relationship, but 2, if you're already in that relationship, evaluate that relationship with God. See, the most important thing in our lives should be God. And he wants to be the most important thing in your life. He was willing to die for you and able to be in your life. And so that makes him the most important thing to us. And so if we want to glorify God in our relationships, we need to bring him into it.